1830. Of the 24 United States, half were slave states. Of the 2 million enslaved, half were women. For those women not enslaved, voting, speaking in public, preaching in church, and a formal education were not permitted. When a woman married, usually at a young age, her property became her husband's. Her body was not hers to control. She was expected to bear many children and raise them while tending to the labors of a 19th century household. If a woman wanted to work, there were few options. She could be a teacher, seamstress, housekeeper, or mill worker, but she would be paid 1/3 of what men in the same positions were paid, yet expected to pay taxes in full. Even what she earned was not her own, as her husband could collect her wages from her employer at any time. Legally, she was her husband's property. If he beat her, she had no recourse. If he abused her, she could not divorce him. If he wanted a divorce, he could take her children and leave her destitute.
The United States women's rights movement of the 1800s came to life in the ancestral home of the Haudenosaunee, dubbed Iroquois by French and English settlers. This land, called the state of New York after colonization, was home to a variety of women's lived experiences. Middle-class white women aired the frustration of their constrained realities to one another. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would go on to be a leader in the women's rights movement, described attending a small tea party of disgruntled women, where in addition to serving tea, she also poured out the torrent of her long accumulating discontent. Meanwhile, black women were living in a state that had just ended slavery. Full emancipation arrived in 1827 for New Yorkers. Women like Harriet Jacobs and Sojourner Truth had both endured the torture of slavery and were now sharing their personal stories as activists for abolition and supporters of women's rights. And the women of the 6 indigenous nations of the Haudenosaunee were living in communities that modeled women's equality to men. They owned property, had a voice in religious life, nominated leaders, and removed them if necessary. Some early women's rights leaders had interactions with the Haudenosaunee, including Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was adopted into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation and given a name meaning "she who holds the sky." Charlotte Woodward, 19 years old. At first we had traveled quite alone, but before we had gone many miles, we came on other wagon loads of women, bound in the same direction. At different crossroads, we saw wagons coming from every part of the country, and before we reached Seneca Falls, we were a procession. When Charlotte's wagon reached the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, over 300 people were there, including 40 men who were permitted inside, but not allowed to speak for the first day. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton presented the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, her voice was so quiet that many struggled to hear her. The document, modeled after the Declaration of Independence, contained 11 resolutions to be voted upon the following day. All resolutions passed easily, except the one Stanton had authored alone, which called for the enfranchisement of women. One man stood to defend the resolution. His name was Frederick Douglass, and after he spoke, it passed by 2 votes.
(1853), Broadway Tabernacle, New York. Sojourner Truth had endured much in her life. But she refused to let her life's light be determined by the darkness that surrounded her. years after Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton became friends with a woman whose name would one day be synonymous with women's suffrage, Susan B. Anthony. Susan was unmarried and able to travel and lecture while Elizabeth was busy tending to many children at home. A partnership was formed, or as Elizabeth put it, I forged the thunderbolts and Susan fired them. On November 5th, 1872, Anthony voted illegally, setting into motion a plan she hoped would eventually gain the women's vote. The 14th Amendment contained ambiguous language. Stanton and Anthony hoped it could be exploited for the cause of women's suffrage. If all persons born in the United States were citizens, didn't that include women? Weren't women citizens? Seeing an ad in a Rochester paper that encouraged registration for the upcoming election, Susan took her 3 sisters and 11 other women down to the local barbershop. At first they were ignored and then asked to leave. But when Susan read the 14th Amendment to the registrars and threatened to sue, the men surprisingly agreed. They were convinced by Susan's promise that she would pay their fines if the government ever came after them. Her act of voting became a national story, yet 13 days later, a federal marshal knocked at her door. Seeming embarrassed, he indicated Susan was to be arrested and should come downtown, but no rush. Susan insisted that if he believed her to be a criminal, he should arrest her just as he would any man. She went to change, and upon returning, presented her wrist to the officer for handcuffing. He would not cuff her, but did accompany her. As they boarded the trolley, the driver asked for her fare, and she announced, loudly for every passenger to hear, that she was traveling at the expense of the federal government. Pointing at the marshal, she said, "Ask him for my fare." After her lawyer bailed her out of jail, Susan B. Anthony spent the months before her trial delivering a lecture titled, "Is it a crime for a citizen of the United States to vote?" She gave this lecture in all 29 towns of Monroe County and convinced so many people of her reasoning that the prosecution had to move the case to a neighboring county.
The United States versus Susan B. Anthony took place on June of 1873 and lasted 2 days. With all-white, all-male jury and a judge who had written his decision before any of the evidence was presented, it was hardly a fair trial. Susan had not been allowed to speak until the final day when the judge ordered her to stand and asked, "Has the prisoner anything to say why sentence shall not be pronounced?" The judge ordered Susan B. Anthony to sit down, something he would have to do 6 separate times before she was finished, and he sentenced her to pay a fine of $100 plus the cost of prosecution, but Susan had thoughts on that. Susan B. Anthony kept her word to the judge. She never paid the $100 fine for as long as she had lived, traveling in frozen rail cars, bone-jarring carriages, and often being refused hotel rooms because she was alone. She tirelessly lectured, lobbied, and petitioned, devoting her entire life to the cause of women's rights. She encouraged younger women to try their wings, as she put it, by cultivating their writing and speaking abilities. And though she did not live to see the day that women could vote, she knew the day would come. In the year of her passing, at age 86, she was still inspiring those who would carry her banner forward.
I stayed in Susan B. Anthony's house, had a speaking engagement in Rochester. The next morning she had some errands in town, so she said I could use her stenographer.
Ida B. Wells Barnett was born in Mississippi 6 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. After losing both parents and a sibling to yellow fever, she convinced the school board in Memphis that she was 18 years old so she could be hired as a teacher and provide for her younger siblings. 8 years later, Ida was fired from teaching for writing about school corruption in the newspaper column. A talented writer, Ida decided to start her own newspaper. Ida's paper grew to be a successful endeavor. She boldly called out white supremacy and shined a light of truth on the horrors of lynching in the South. But when her friends who owned a grocery business were lynched, and she published that their lynchings were because they were economically successful black men, an angry white mob destroyed her newspaper building while she was away on a trip. Armed men waited outside her home to kill her, and her friends warned her that she could not return to Memphis. So Ida fled to Chicago.
The stenographer never ventured upstairs. I simply assumed she was occupied. But when Susan B. Anthony got back from town, the mood intensified, and downstairs she went swiftly to ask the stenographer why she did not show.
The stenographer told Susan B. Anthony that she would not take dictation from a woman of color.
Susan B. Anthony steeled her gaze, and she spoke calm and low. An insult to my guest is an insult to me. Come get your bonnet and go.
An activist on multiple fronts, Ida fought to help women gain the right to vote in Illinois and confronted white women who ignored women of color in the movement. A founding member of the NAACP, she established the Alpha Suffrage Club and lectured internationally. Taking on injustice was a lifelong pursuit for Ida. Even as a teacher in the South, she sued the railroad when they forcibly removed her from her car.
A woman's place is a clean train car. I paid 30 cents for my ticket. When the conductor tried to put me in the smoking car, I told him, sir, I won't took me to the smoke and squalor. I sued the railroad and won $500. Yes, white women need the ballot, but my women even more. I'd like to buy a railroad ticket and choose my own car. When the men try to put you where you don't belong, you square your jaw and fix your gaze. 'Cause a woman's seat is the seat she bought when a woman knows her place.
March 1913. The staging grounds near the Capitol filled with women finding their places. Washington, D.C. was about to experience a parade like no other. Horses neighed, wagons creaked, and musicians warmed up. Women marching was a radical idea. Men marched, not women. The parade organizers, Alice Paul and Lucie Burns, wanted to show how power did not rest only with men. They also knew that this was the perfect day, given Woodrow Wilson's inauguration was the next day, and there would be lots of press in town. Inez Milholland led the charge, riding a white horse, wearing a gold tiara. She would forever be known as the Joan of Arc of suffrage. Behind her, the first wagon of the parade bore a massive banner stating the women's demands. There were 8,000 women on Pennsylvania Avenue in academic gowns and work uniforms. There were banners from almost every state, including a delegation from Illinois, the state that Ida B. Wells had traveled from Chicago to join. Unfortunately, Illinois, like many states, wanted only white women in their delegation. These states worried that Southern voters would not support suffrage if black women were seen marching alongside. Ida was asked to march in the back of the parade with the rest of the black women. At 52 years old, and having done more for suffrage than most of white Illinois delegates, she was incensed. Wounded, but determined to take her rightful place, she did not go to the back, but instead waited on the sidelines. And when Illinois marched by, Ida stepped out of the crowd, linked arms with two allies near the front, and marched the entire rest of the parade.
Take a stand for the right to vote, for
We all believe in the idea of democracy. Women's suffrage is the application of democracy to women. Mabel Pinghua Li, suffragist and the first Chinese woman to earn a doctorate in the United States. When the doorkeeper got up to let Mabel Vernon sit down, her friend joked it was because she looked pregnant. Indeed, Mabel had secretly pinned a large banner under her skirts. President Woodrow Wilson was giving his December address to Congress, and at the opportune moment, Mabel unfurled the yellow sateen, dropping it over the balcony with the help of her friends. A murmur rustled through the floor, but in this moment, and in subsequent meetings, Woodrow Wilson remained unmoved. Harriet Stanton Blatch floated a new idea, the silent sentinels, an unceasing presence of women at the White House gates with message banners in the suffrage colors of purple, yellow, and white. This would be radical. Labor pickets were one thing, but to take up a grievance with a president? No one had ever picketed the White House like this before. The first line of sentinels arrived in January of 1917. The sentinels kept watch through all of winter, and apart from the occasional insult, things had been fairly calm. But when the U.S. entered World War I in April, picketing a wartime president was seen as unpatriotic. The banners were sharply worded, calling out the president and the envoys from other countries. Angry mobs threw rocks and eggs. Banners were torn, and women were shoved, kicked, and dragged across pavement. For the next 2 years, almost 500 women would be arrested on ludicrous charges, such as obstructing traffic or meeting on public grounds. And as the women persisted, the prison sentences grew even longer. When the leader of the National Woman's Party, Alice Paul, was sentenced to 7 months in the district jail, she wrote her mother not to worry, reassuring her it would merely be a delightful rest. But Alice's reality in prison would be far from delightful. Before her sentence was over, Alice would be subjected to a foul-smelling cell. Meals of worm-ridden pork, placed in solitary confinement, deprived of sleep, and ultimately moved to the psychopathic ward, having her mental fitness questioned. Alice went on hunger strike to protest the horrible conditions. 3 times a day she was strapped down, a tube shoved up her nose, and milk and raw eggs funneled down her throat. Fellow suffragist Rose Winslow endured the same treatment, smuggling out details of their conditions on scraps of paper. If the Wilson administration thought they would weaken the suffragists by torturing their leader, they were undoubtedly surprised on November 10th, when the longest picket line yet appeared outside the White House. Over 30 women were arrested, including Lucie Burns, who helped form the National Women's Party with Alice Paul. All of them were sent to the Occoquan workhouse, away from Allison District Jail. The women were greeted upon arrival by the workhouse superintendent and up to 40 angry men wielding clubs. Women were beaten, choked, and violently thrown into cells, some knocked unconscious. Lucie Burns' hands were tied over her head. Her clothes stripped off. She was left only with a blanket. Calling out to the others, she was threatened with a gag and straitjacket. One woman had a heart attack. While the others cried for help, the guards ignored their pleas. This evening would be known as the Night of Terror. As many as 30 women would go on hunger strikes in protest of the horrible treatment in prison, many enduring forced feedings just as Alice Paul had. The administration, faced with negative press and women who could not be broken, released all the suffrage prisoners by the end of November. Upon the release, Alice Paul proclaimed, "We are put out of jail as we are put in, at the whim of government. They tried to terrorize us. They could not, so they freed us." The Susan B. Anthony Amendment passed the House in 1918, but failed to clear the Senate. So the suffragists continued their protests. The watchfires involved burning copies of Woodrow Wilson's speeches as the empty words that they were. And in February of 1919, a trainload of former suffrage prisoners went on a cross-country speaking tour telling of their experiences. By May, a newly elected pro-suffrage majority of Congress would ensure the Susan B. Anthony Amendment passed both the House and the Senate with relative ease. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. From here, the amendment would need to be ratified by 36 states. Though public sentiment on suffrage was shifting, there is much work left to be done.
Alice Paul raised a toast and unfurled a celebratory banner outside headquarters. She had been quietly sewing a new star on the banner for each state that ratified the 19th Amendment, and now it was finished. 36 stars, 36 states. In August of 1920, all eyes were on Tennessee, the final state to ratify. In Nashville, freshman legislator Harry Byrne had an anti-suffrage red rose on his lapel, but the letter in his pocket weighed more heavily on his mind.
Mrs. J.L. Byrne was a widowed, tax-paying landowner, and when her son Harry cast his vote of aye, the room gave way to confused gasps. Had it really happened? Had women actually won the vote? The room exploded. There was weeping, screaming, and singing. Dr. Mary Walker was the first woman to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. A surgeon and a spy in the Civil War, she wrote, "Nothing but the ballot in a woman's hand will right these wrongs." But for women of color, the struggle was more complex than this. Having picketed with the Silent Sentinels, Mary Church Terrell wrote, "A white woman only has one handicap to overcome, that of sex. I have two, both sex and race." Black suffragists work hard in their churches and communities, often being ignored by white suffragists and written out of historical records. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper remarked, "I do not believe that giving women the ballot is going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that like men, they may be divided into the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good will vote according to their convictions and principles. The bad is dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party."
The 19th Amendment was a 72-year struggle, but for women of color, the struggle would continue. Zakala Shah of the Yankton Sioux heritage fought for Indigenous Americans to gain citizenship in 1924. The right to vote, however, was decided state by state, with New Mexico and Arizona being the last in 1948. Chinese immigrants would vote in 1943, and for black women, repeatedly suppressed at the polls. The poll tax was ended in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act created in 1965. Voters with disabilities were given special protections in 1982. As Carrie Chapman Catt said, "Women have suffered an agony of soul which you can never comprehend. That you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it."